everybody. Thank you for being here to listen to us talking about a subject many of you are familiar with. So we're going to listen mainly to an organization which faced a cyber attack, and the whole aim is to understand the measures, the impact in that crisis situation. So, hello everybody, Stéphane Cordier. I'm the Director of Transformation of the Baccarat sites. And Frédéric Daniel, I am Remediation Manager for Orange Cyber Defense France, coordinating response resources for entities in crises to enhance their defense. So should we talk about the background a bit? So I will reveal a secret. So Baccarat was attacked, and I'm counting on you to keep that a secret. In September of last year, Baccarat is a French luxury group, 260 years of existence, working in crystal glass. We are present pretty much all over the world. Our leading market is Japan, then the US. We're starting to develop further into Asia with also a lot of personnel and designers around the world. 1,100 people, in all of whom about 700 purely in manufacturing, working in 3 shifts each day. So you can't shut down the furnaces in a glassworks. Some of them have been modernized, but you have to keep those furnaces going 24/7 in terms of IT system. There's about 100 or so applications, 75% on-site and about 25% in the cloud initially. 2 main apps, on the one hand to manage production, manufacturing, orders, logistics, and then the marketing and sales and stock sides was the 2 parts to this. So the crisis, it was the Black Basta group which attacked on the 19th of September, which encrypted the whole of the IS locally in France, the US, Japan, Asia. All the local servers in the local infrastructures of Baccarat were encrypted. So we launched the crisis response on the 19th with Frédéric and Orange there to support us. So it shut down for 2.5 months. That was very significant. So Baccarat is a company that's 260 years old, but hadn't been prepared really for cyber attacks, and had grown quite autonomously on its different markets. Each market still has its own ERP. They have their own networks. They have their own governance for their information systems. There wasn't a group IS until I arrived. And so quickly they had to review the situation, understand it, understand the measures that were required, coordinate all that action globally with the different stakeholders who until now had been working independently, autonomously within their geographical scope, and all that in a very short period of time. So let's have a look at, we'll have a look at how that happened. But to talk about the attack, discrete, stealth attack methods, I know some of you are familiar with these, but it's just to give you some feedback on the things we have observed in 2023. There have been all sorts of things said about how attackers got into such and such a system. Is it vulnerabilities or not? But what we have seen a lot is theft of legitimate accounts to get initial access to the information system. For example, VPNs without MFA. Compromising the supply chain, so compromising via client or supplier accounts. That's something which perhaps we've seen more of in 2023 as attackers realize that security systems have been brought in, that there are tools, and so they seek to be more discrete, using legitimate remote access tools, TeamViewer, AnyDesk, anything that your classical administrator might use, which then allows them to get through more easily. Then they do reconnaissance with legitimate tools like NetScan. They use classical Windows commands, the sort of things you do yourselves on your servers. They then make attempts to use the internal vulnerabilities, and that brings us to that big issue of vulnerabilities we've been talking about for a long time. But they aren't necessarily the points of access, but are used more often for disseminating the attacks through the system. I'll go through this quite quickly. Obviously, then there are some quite classical methods. Encryption of hypervisors, where they directly, because it's more complicated to go and get that on an encrypted MDK, and it can do more damage, and there can be vulnerabilities. And then the deletion of backups, because if we look at the main vulnerabilities in 2022 have been in virtualization networks on Veeam and on a number of messaging apps. So I won't go into that in more detail, because perhaps what's interesting here is to look to see what happened at Baccarat. So for Baccarat, what happened is that at global level, we received a message via Teams from the general management. Because our Teams wasn't cut off from the outside, we received a false message, a fake message with an attachment with supposedly the results for the year, supposedly from the senior management. It was obviously a fake. 15 people did click on the link and open up the door to Blackbuster. The email was sent on the 14th of September, and the attack started on the 19th in the morning. Around the world, in the US, Japan, Europe. So on the day of the 22nd, on the 22nd, we need to understand what has been happening, contact everybody, work with Orange quickly to start to come up with a remediation plan to deal with the situation. So this is a very short example between the intrusion and the launch of the attack. Often it's more like 90 days or a month and a half here, and this is tending to get shorter and shorter, this period of time. So shall we look now at the measures themselves, which are things we see quite regularly, and the difficulties in implementing these measures in a crisis situation. And it's to show that it can be interesting to do these things before the crisis actually happens. We started the day in the dark. We had no networks, we had nothing. So you become very suspicious of everything. Has the messaging system been attacked? Do they have access to the messaging? Can they see our emails? Are they reading some of our messages, etc.? So we had doubts about certain operations. Sometimes we wanted to launch operations and we could see the reactions on the network, which weren't necessarily normal. So you're very much in the dark in those first days. So that important thing, in fact, is to prepare beforehand. There is one important thing, which is knowing your information system, to have mapping of the infrastructure, networks, the apps. Often the attackers know our aliases better than us. So how did this work out for you? What can you tell us about? For us, the difficulty, as I explained at the beginning, was that our different geographical areas, US, Japan, were quite independent. Hitherto, they had their own networks, they had their own infrastructures, they managed their security policies. And so the first thing to be done was to try to have mapping, to review the existing system, how the network was structured, whether the network equipment was up to date. That's what we had to do urgently, to recover what documentation we could, because a lot of the documentation was on servers which had been encrypted. We didn't necessarily have access to a lot of the basic data. That was the first step. But when we talk about preparation for crisis management and having all the emergency contacts and the communication means, regarding these points, what you're saying, you weren't prepared for this. In your opinion, could it have enabled you to shorten the response time or to be more effective at the beginning? I've faced two cyber attacks in two different companies, so I can give you some feedback on this. But Baccarat is a small company, an intermediate-sized company. The board had never had this sort of experience. And the way I see it is that today on the market, the IT side is perhaps a bit easier. The biggest difficulty is actually managing the crisis, managing the communication, managing the clients, the stress, the support that you need to require, and mobilizing the teams. So I had the advantage of being familiar with Orange from a previous cyber attack experience. We could establish that contact very quickly. You can't start doing a call for bids when you're facing a cyber attack. So here, it's better if you do already have those contacts. So the other aspects are the access, control of access to the system. I've noted here some of the elements that we can put in that trusted core. But if you look at the segmentation and segregation of the network, there's a lot of interconnections between the sites, between the countries, with not necessarily any control between some of them. It was like a big open space. As I said to the board, once someone had got into Baccarat, it was a huge open space. You had access to all the different rooms, all the documents. Once you were in, you could see everything, and hence the advantage of segmenting, putting up barriers within the network and having to open doors to get access, to force the attackers to get past doors to get access to information. So now we're trying to segment the system, the whole of the network, more effectively, with more security barriers which are better controlled. And that segmentation also is something you had to do in a crisis situation. What can you tell us about that? For us, for a month and a half, I don't remember exactly the dates, almost 2 months, we had no network at all, no internet. Fortunately, most of our ERPs are on the cloud, which is good they weren't attacked. The drawback is that you need a network to have access to them. So the segmentation was done later when we started rebuilding, after a month and a half or 2 months. So when we got 4G access, telephones, before really getting down to the segmentation of the networks. We had to change technical equipment, find the suppliers, make sure the equipment or hardware was available, and it's not easy. The other issue was the external access to the VPN and needing stricter authentication. But that's not easy. Users moan very easily about when access is more difficult. So now we've closed all the VPN access. It's simpler. There is just access on Office 365 with MFA. Because what we discovered is that even if you have MFA, on the American market, they had already implemented the MFA, but the regulation of the system wasn't necessarily very good. It's not because you've activated that it's necessarily done effectively, and that you don't need an MFA policy to control things generally. And for the users, how did you get them to use the MFA? So on the whole, the crisis, I would say, brought everyone together. People were feeling very mobilized. The I team at the Baccarat site is 10 people. They're not big teams. But very quickly, the people from production came to help. The printers needed reconfiguring, logistics, communication. Communication is complicated to manage when you have no email. And so the users really mobilized, made efforts. People feel very strongly about their company. And so the users now do understand. They have this got them to understand, and many of them now say, okay, now we've sorted that out. What do we do now? How do we manage this over time? And that might be more difficult. One thing I kept for afterwards was the Active Directory, and I won't just spend too much time on this. There's been a lot of conferences here on Active Directory, but we needed to rework the way the Active Directories were interconnected. We did them all over again because, bit like with MFA, there were different management policies and rights policies in different places, which were more or less effective. Not in the teams, not enough awareness of the system. So it was important to provide support for the complete reconstruction of these activities. We took back control over the Active Directory, so now we have control at the Baccarat team over the Active Directories for Japan and Asia, not the US, because there's a bigger team over there. But we do now manage the Active Directory for Japan and for Asia, which was not the case beforehand, to have a better structured policy. So once again, making things much stricter and securing the environment. So now let's talk about some basic hygiene. So control and surveillance, these weren't necessarily things which you had beforehand. So this was all rolled out in the emergency situation. So we had to go through all the workstations, all the servers, all the machines, sometimes with some reluctance from certain users. We reformatted between the beginning of September and the end of January. I think we must have worked on each workstation 3 or 4 times. We changed passwords, we installed the EDR, we put in place the MFA. So all the support necessary for the users. So teams working permanently for 2.5 months under pressure. Well, we were lucky enough to have teams, the different teams which really took part, sales teams who then trained their field teams on the rollout of the EDR, the MFA, all sorts of subjects like this. And so really the different departments really made every effort. Another subject is the external backups. So did this help much for the backup? We had a lot of things locally, a lot of servers and small applications locally, which we lost, which needed rebuilding after the cyber attack. So after the cyber attack, we took this opportunity to do away with all the things we had locally. So we decided to do that. We did a call for tender for the storage more centrally. So now everything has been migrated to Azure. And we consolidated all that for the different markets. And the backups, that is still a subject that we are working on, because we have an Azure environment which is backed up by Microsoft, but that's not necessarily sufficient. We do want to go further with this, have other accounts on the cloud to share this differently. So that is a subject we're still working on. And with that migration to Azure, the management of the information system and obsolescence, patch management, did these things become simpler with this change? Or quite the opposite? I don't know if IT is ever that simple, but the complex thing here is that my teams have some understanding of the cloud, but not necessarily really expertise about cloud management, securing cloud environments, pricing management in the cloud. These are things you need some basic information about. And here we were in an emergency situation, as I've already said. So we provided support. We brought in an expert to work with us, a CISO from Orange, to work with this on best practice and on setting up governance and training for the teams. And the last subject which comes to mind here, and which links in with the type of attack, is the control of the different tools used in the information system. That was something that, so limiting the operating tools or operating on a whitelist basis, that's something that remains as yet still to be done. Yeah. We haven't done that yet, managing the users' access rights, the applications. That's still done in a very sort of manual way when it comes to governance and subjects like that. The advantage is that this helps us today. I was with the board yesterday evening, and they are very much aware and of the management committee and the users of the fact it is urgent to allocate the budget to sort out the governance and to set up these different things. So that's a good thing. Having said that, you need time and you need preparation. So 18 months of roadmap, several months after the attack. So have you been working with the executive committee? We've been very busy. To give you some feedback, what's complicated? I think the IT side, on the whole, the reconstruction is all a bit mechanical. You install servers, you bring in governance, security. That's our job, basically. So we're in familiar territory there. What's more complicated is managing crisis communication. And the advantage at Baccarat is that we communicated straight away. We announced we had been attacked. We communicated very broadly with our clients and in the press with everybody. We were very transparent about the risks. We called all our clients to warn them. We called them individually. Obviously, the key clients. We communicated very broadly to prepare for this, and now we're building the roadmap for what comes afterwards, and there we're looking to install the next bricks over the coming months, under pressure from the board, of course, to avoid this happening again, because that would be very damaging for the company. And so as genuine awareness raising of the executive committee, putting together the roadmap, the budgets that we need to avoid this recurring again too quickly. I think inevitably things like this happen, but perhaps master it, control it better when it does happen, and to prepare and to be ready to have the securest methods possible to make the startup afterwards all the easier. If I have still 5 minutes, we ended up having difficulties with very simple, straightforward things. Obviously, we do deliveries all over the world, and we ended up having problems with the customs declarations tool, which is currently an online tool provided by the French state. As we no longer had network access, we couldn't do deliveries, we couldn't do the customs documents, and we had to find partners, the forwarding companies, who accepted to do the customs declarations for us, and that necessarily has an impact on your organization. Often you're familiar with your ERP, but you're less aware of the things around it, the more peripheral systems. We couldn't do wage slips, for example, because the human resources system was working, but the human resources people needed access to a file which was on a server which was encrypted, and so they couldn't do the wage slips. So it's a lot of the marginal, more peripheral things that ends up causing more problems. Thank you very much, Stéphane. Thank you for that feedback, for sharing that information with us. Thank you. And aside, so who knew that Baccarat had been attacked? Oh, the press. So there are some people who were aware. So if you have any questions, they will need a microphone, or we won't be able to hear the question for the translation. Why was the cloud infrastructure not affected? There were some. In fact, our ERPs are on a software as a service basis. The cloud, perhaps they didn't have time. They perhaps could have got in with our open space approach. It wasn't sufficiently protected with the password, but they didn't. Perhaps they didn't have time during their reconnaissance operations to for something like that, we can't say. They had the means to do it, but they didn't. I'm sorry, we can't hear the question if there isn't a microphone. Perhaps it's bigger. So today we have nothing. I don't know nothing of what, but that's part of the roadmap, the 18-month roadmap. In all transparency, where we're building everything, we're studying the different options and how we can secure things. There's an administration network which has been created in the meantime, with workstations with limited access. And again, we can't hear the question. There should be a microphone somewhere. Okay, so I joined Baccarat at the end of 2022. I did a penetration test, a pen test, from outside Baccarat without a phishing attack, and the result was quite positive. We didn't have obvious vulnerabilities. However, I didn't have time to test this. This was the biggest failing, and once they got in with our open space, it was easy. And a few months after that, I launched a campaign of phishing tests and training just in France to test the solution. And so we started raising the awareness of the staff about this sort of attack, but we had just started that awareness raising process. So the cost of the crisis and the budget you need to secure things. Baccarat is a company that does about 220 million turnover each year. The cost of the crisis, about 2 million over those 3 months. Fortunately, the shops, the boutiques could continue to sell. We returned to hard copy paper invoices. The payment terminals are 4G, so the customers could continue to pay, and we did paper invoices, so that meant that we could, it didn't have too big an impact on the 2023 budget. The budget for reconstruction isn't finalized, between 400 and 500 million. Sorry, 400 and 500,000, not 400 and 500 million. I was just trying to see if you were asleep. So between 400 and 500,000, not million. We can take one or two more questions. Hello. So we've seen cases like this for a few years now, but for you, how come the consequences were so great for a company like yours? Is it a question of budget? Is it a question of management, or of the technical level of the teams, or architecture? Baccarat is 260 years old. It's still a small company, however. It's an SME, managed like any SME. And cyber attacks were seen as something that didn't really concern the company. Everybody knew what a cyber attack was, they knew the risk, but they didn't actually do anything to deal with that. So for lack of resources, the company belonged to a family until 10, 15 years ago. Then there'd been quite a few changes and different investors, to be perfectly transparent. That's all that's available in the press. And so over the past 2 years, we've been rebuilding Baccarat, making a lot of investments. We've just started up a new furnace on the Baccarat site, which is being lit up and heated. It takes more than a month to heat up a furnace. It's not just like switching on your microwave. So we're investing hugely, including on the IT side of things and security, and the industrial information system. So it's all these different factors. One last question. The 19th of September, if I remember correctly, was a Friday. Sorry, so it was triggered on a Friday. Sorry, we couldn't hear the question as there's no microphone. I think we reacted well without sounding like I'm singing my own praises. I shut off the networks very quickly. I communicated very quickly globally. We set up a crisis unit within an hour. I informed the management committee, who stepped in straight away. So I think we did react quite effectively. For the people who clicked, perhaps they hadn't had their awareness raised enough. We had cut off outside access. The teams tried to check to see what the cause and the risk was from that Teams message, but they didn't go far enough for lack of awareness. And again, it's a small team, and we need to retrain our IT teams and our personnel on these risks. And obviously, of course, we need to train ourselves on the risks, on the methods, and this work needs to be done over these 18 months to upskill everybody, especially when it comes to understanding risk. We have gone over time. I don't know if we can take... Can we take... No, finished. If you have questions, we can see you afterwards. I would imagine that you were under a certain amount of pressure from the management. No. To be perfectly transparent, the crisis was handled very professionally and in a very calm way. All the action, the communication was well structured, well organized, well intentioned. We received good support and weren't under abnormal pressure from the management. Was there never any point where the management considered giving in to the blackmail from Baccarat? That was an immediate decision. We were not going to pay, so that was... We did ask ourselves the question as they launched the attack on the 19th. At one point, we wondered whether we should get in touch with them to try to get them to wait. But in the end, they weren't particularly active. And did you have a contact? And we did communicate with the ANSSI as well, and they were in contact with us. Others do it, but I don't know what. I'm not sure whether legally it's legal to pay the ransom. We have to... Sorry, hello. I've got the microphone. I'm going to ask my question. On the backup project and your future backup, what sort of good practices do you have in mind? What we look at is how to secure all our Microsoft 365 environments, because Microsoft guaranteed the structure, not the content. There's no warranty, no guarantee on the content. And so we switched a lot of things over to Azure. We've been looking into taking a contract with another hosting company to have copies with different hosting companies. Thank you very much. And we are going to stop there. And we will be staying here at the front for a short time. If you have any other questions, thank you very much.